The gavel slammed down at the Austin Elite cattle auction. Uncle Silas had just won a reckless bidding war for a six-figure prize bull to salvage his bruised ego after my cousin Beatrice's public humiliation of me. Instead of celebrating, Silas turned, his eyes cold, and handed the massive invoice directly to me. He called it my mandatory family contribution. I stared at the invoice. $245,000, my entire life savings. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a ransom demand. I didn't cry. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I simply opened my banking app, looking at the life savings I had bled for, and prepared to zero out my accounts. To understand this transaction, you have to look at the ledger of my life with Marion and Silas. I was taken in by my aunt and uncle as a child, an orphaned niece absorbed into their sprawling Texas ranching empire. But I was never a daughter. I was a silent investor in their version of family, and the returns were exclusively theirs. I ran the entire veterinary operation for their livestock single-handedly. I was up at 3 a.m. pulling calves, stitching lacerations, and managing herd health while my cousins, Beatrice and Warren, slept in silk sheets. I was the hired help they didn't have to pay, saving them hundreds of thousands in veterinary fees over the years. I spent my youth knee-deep in mud and blood while they attended galas. It's terrifying how easily abuse disguises itself as routine. When you are raised in an environment where your only value is your utility, you stop expecting affection and start anticipating demands. This is the trap of brutal normalization. You don't realize you are being exploited because the exploitation is the only language of belonging you have ever been taught. You mistake surviving for living. You accept the crumbs of their tolerance and call it a meal. You convince yourself that if you just work harder, diagnose the illnesses faster, save more of their livestock, you might eventually earn a seat at the table. But the table was never meant for you. Marion and Silas had spent years conditioning me to believe that my invisible labor was the rent I owed for existing in their space. As the auctioneer called for the next lot, the public pressure mounted. The elite of the Texas Hill Country were watching. Marion stood beside Silas, her face a mask of expectant entitlement. Beatrice smirked, a perfectly manicured predator enjoying the show. They expected me to break. They expected me to beg. Instead, I saw the situation with absolute clarity. This wasn't a family dynamic, it was an extortion racket. They were using public humiliation to force a financial transfer. I walked to the clerk's desk. I didn't ask why they were doing this. I didn't plead for mercy. I handed over my banking details and authorized the wire transfer. $245,000. My emergency fund, my escape fund, gone in a keystroke. The clerk looked at me with a mix of pity and shock, but I felt neither. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only a cold, sharp focus. I was zeroing out my account, yes, but I was also finalizing the audit of our relationship. I had paid my final invoice. The debt of my upbringing was cleared. They weren't shocked by their own cruelty. They were just waiting for my compliance. But as I signed the final transfer document, I knew the dynamic had permanently shifted. I was no longer their dependent. I was their creditor. As the confirmation receipt printed, the financial reality set in. I was completely broke. The account that held the key to my eventual freedom was empty. But as I walked away from the clerk's desk, the psychological weight of my subjugation was far heavier than the lost capital. I had handed over my entire future to satisfy a debt manufactured by Silas's fragile ego. People looking from the outside always ask the same question. Why didn't she just walk away? Why pay the invoice? Why not just tear up the paper and leave them to default? To ask that is to fundamentally misunderstand the architecture of systemic control. This is the invisible chain of the survivor. My compliance wasn't a symptom of weakness. It was a highly evolved survival mechanism, engineered by a toxic environment. When you are raised by emotional terrorists, obedience is the currency you use to buy physical and psychological safety. You learn to absorb the hit, to pay the price, to neutralize the threat before it destroys you completely. Walking away wasn't as simple as turning my back. The chain had been forged link by link over 2 decades. It was made of Marion's subtle threats, Silas's financial leverage, and the constant, suffocating reminder that they owned the roof over my head. They had monopolized my resources, isolated my professional network, and constantly threatened to destroy my veterinary license with fabricated misconduct charges if I ever stepped out of line. I paid the invoice because my survival instincts calculated that the immediate destruction of their public wrath was more dangerous than the financial ruin. I was buying time. Every dollar of that $245,000 was a tactical retreat. I didn't feel despair. Despair is an emotion for those who have lost hope. I hadn't lost hope. I had simply recognized the battlefield. I looked across the pavilion. Silas was accepting congratulations from other ranchers, acting the part of the wealthy patriarch. Beatrice was sipping a cocktail, already bored with the destruction of my life savings. Marion was whispering to another society wife, likely spinning a narrative about my dutiful contribution to the family legacy. They believed they had won. They believed my silence was surrender. But silence is just a lack of noise. It isn't a lack of action. I was conducting a silent inventory of every vulnerability they possessed. I knew the exact health of their herds, the precise margins of their operating accounts, the deep, hidden secrets of their breeding programs. I knew the fragile foundations of their ranching empire better than they did, because I was the one who constantly patched the cracks. The invisible chain was still there, but for the first time, I felt the cold, hard iron of it in my hands, analyzing its weak points. I wasn't just a victim caught in a snare. I was a captive who had finally mapped the layout of the prison. The transaction was complete, and my bank account was drained. But the accounting had just begun. Let them enjoy the applause. Let them relish the illusion of their dominance. They had merely purchased their own audit. Just as I turned to leave the auction arena, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the pavilion swung open. The ambient chatter of the Texas elite died instantly. Eleanor had arrived. My great-grandmother, the founding matriarch of the ranching dynasty, moved forward with the slow, terrifying precision of a predator. At 89 years old, she still held absolute authority. The crowd parted for her wheelchair, recognizing the true power in the room. I stopped, analyzing the sudden shift in the environment. Marion's smug expression dissolved into outright panic. Silas visibly shrank, the artificial patriarch suddenly reduced to a frightened boy. Eleanor didn't look at them. Her sharp, unyielding gaze locked onto me, then shifted to the auction clerk holding my transfer receipt. "Cancel that transaction!" Eleanor's voice was a whip crack, slicing through the silent room. "Immediately." Silas took a hesitant step forward. "Mother, we were just—" "Silence," Eleanor commanded, her tone dropping the temperature in the pavilion by 10 degrees. She wheeled herself directly into the center of the ring, addressing the entire assembly. "I have watched this family rot from the inside out. I have watched Marion and Silas parade around as the stewards of my legacy while behaving like common thieves. And today, I have watched them attempt to extort the only person in this bloodline who possesses an ounce of integrity." This was the silent regret of the gatekeeper finally finding its voice. Eleanor had built the empire, but she had handed the keys to the wrong generation. For years, she had watched from the periphery, hoping her descendants would outgrow their cruelty, hoping the land would teach them character. But gatekeepers who observe abuse without intervening become its architects. Her silence had been a tactical error, a miscalculation in her ledger of family management. Now, the audit was due. If she had remained absent, the reality was grim. The world without Eleanor would have been a systematic execution of my future. Without her intervention, Silas and Marion would have continued to bleed my finances dry, legally trapping me within their corporate structure until I was nothing more than an indentured servant to their debt. The empire would have collapsed under their incompetence, but not before they dragged me down with the wreckage. Her presence was the ultimate act of swift, unyielding justice. "There will be no extortion today," Eleanor stated, locking eyes with Silas. "There will, however, be an immediate, comprehensive forensic audit of the entire family estate. Every account, every land sale, every veterinary invoice." Beatrice let out a small, terrified gasp. Eleanor turned her devastating gaze toward her. "You are stripped of your trust access, Beatrice. All of you are. You thought you could publicly bankrupt Clara for your amusement. Instead, you have just bankrupted yourselves." Eleanor signaled to her attorney, who had quietly stepped into the room behind her. File the injunctions. Freeze the accounts. She looked at me, her expression cold but approving. Come with me, Clara. We have a business to restructure. The power had flipped in a matter of seconds. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just walked behind her wheelchair, stepping over the ashes of my aunt and uncle's destroyed pride. We retreated to the historic estate, a sprawling limestone mansion that served as the true headquarters of Eleanor's empire. The heavy oak doors closed behind us, sealing out the noise of the auction and the frantic panic of my aunt and uncle. Eleanor directed her wheelchair to the center of the mahogany-paneled library. There was no sentimentality in the room, only documents stacked high on the central table. Sit down, she instructed. I sat, my mind already calculating the variables of this new reality. I am dying, Eleanor stated. No hesitation, no softening of the blow. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The doctors have given me less than 6 months. I have spent the last 12 weeks preparing a complete reorganization of my assets. I processed the data. No tears, no denial. The one person with the power to protect me had a rapidly approaching expiration date. It was a critical constraint on our timeline. I understand, I said. What is the primary objective before then? Eleanor slid a thick file across the table. The objective is total liquidation of Marion and Silas's authority. Open it. I flipped open the file. It wasn't just an audit. It was a catalog of financial treason. Spreadsheets, transfer logs, and falsified land deeds mapped out a decade of theft. When my biological parents died, their modest but valuable tract of land had been sold. I was told the money was lost to debts. The documents proved otherwise. Silas had appointed himself trustee of my inheritance, falsified court filings claiming the proceeds were used for my upbringing, and quietly siphoned off over $800,000 into his personal accounts. They had funded Beatrice's luxury lifestyle and Silas's reckless investments using the capital meant for my future. It was clinical theft. There is one more asset to discuss, Eleanor said, her voice lowering into a dangerous register. She handed me a separate dossier. It contained the breeding pedigree of the 6-figure prize bull Silas had just purchased, the very bull I had been forced to finance. I scanned the genetic markers and the registration codes. My breath caught in my throat, not just from shock, but from the sheer malicious scale of their cruelty. Silas knew this bull carried the priceless elite lineage that could secure the ranch's fortune for decades, and by forcing me to bankroll it, he was using my own drained funds to build his empire while erasing my father's legacy. Silas hadn't just bought an expensive animal to stroke his ego. He had knowingly purchased the genetic legacy of the brother he destroyed, and he had forced me to pay the invoice. It was a calculated psychological assassination. I closed the dossier. The pieces of the puzzle locked into place with mathematical precision. My aunt and uncle hadn't just been careless guardians. They were financial predators who had actively cannibalized my inheritance and weaponized my father's memory. They didn't just steal from you, Eleanor observed quietly. They tried to make you finance your own erasure. They failed, I replied. My voice was a flat, dead calm. The anger was gone, replaced entirely by strategic focus. They handed me the exact weapon needed to dismantle them. We don't just freeze their accounts, Eleanor. We reclaim the lineage. We reclaim the land. We initiate immediate litigation for the embezzled funds with compound interest. I looked at the paperwork. This isn't revenge anymore. It's asset recovery. The forensic audit was brutal, swift, and entirely legal. Within 72 hours, the scandal surrounding the estate leaked to the regional agricultural media. The hill country thrives on gossip, and the sudden freezing of Silas and Marion's assets was blood in the water. Desperate to spin the narrative and salvage their rapidly dissolving social capital, Beatrice made a catastrophic tactical error. She agreed to appear on a popular live-streamed agricultural podcast, intending to play the victim of a senile matriarch and a manipulative, adopted cousin. I didn't try to stop her. I simply opened my laptop, poured a black coffee, and watched the live feed with clinical detachment. Beatrice sat in the studio, perfectly styled, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. She spun a tale of family unity torn apart by my supposed greed. But the podcast host, a veteran agricultural journalist who had been anonymously supplied with a summary of the audit, didn't buy the performance. He pivoted smoothly from sympathetic nods to a targeted interrogation. "Beatrice," the host asked, holding up a printout, "how do you address the allegations regarding the $800,000 missing from Clara's parents' land trust? The funds that seemingly financed your luxury vehicle and trust account?" Beatrice's carefully constructed mask shattered. Her eyes widened, and the panic set in. She was experiencing the illusion of power in an empty wallet. For her entire life, Beatrice's status, her confidence, and her arrogance were entirely subsidized by stolen capital. She believed she possessed intrinsic value, but her superiority was merely a rented luxury. When the money vanished, the facade collapsed, revealing the absolute void beneath. She had no character, no resilience, and no intellect to fall back on. Stripped of her stolen wealth, she was utterly defenseless against reality. Cornered and humiliated on a live broadcast, her panic mutated into defensive rage. "That money was used for legitimate family and ranch expenses," Beatrice snapped, her voice shrill and unhinged. "My parents took her in and raised her for 20 years. She owed us everything. My parents had every legal right to manage those funds to keep this estate running, and she was lucky to even have a roof over her head." I watched the comment section of the live stream explode. The host sat in stunned silence. Beatrice had just broadcast a full, uncoerced confession of financial exploitation to tens of thousands of viewers. She hadn't just admitted to the theft, she had proudly justified it. She had handed the prosecution a neatly packaged viral admission of guilt. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply took a screenshot of the exact moment her life imploded and forwarded the video link to Eleanor's legal team with a 2-word message: Exhibit A. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd stopped playing along. Beatrice thought she was controlling the narrative, but she had merely live-streamed her own financial and social execution. The broadcast ended abruptly, but the damage was irreversible. Their reputation in the Texas Hill Country was instantly annihilated. They were no longer elite ranchers. They were exposed parasites. I closed my laptop. The retaliation was complete. Now, it was time to collect the ashes. The legal proceedings were a masterclass in swift, clinical eradication. Armed with the irrefutable forensic audit and Beatrice's spectacular, viral confession, Eleanor's attorneys moved with devastating precision. They systematically stripped Marion, Silas, and Beatrice of every ounce of their unearned status and wealth. The courts ordered massive restitution for the embezzled trust funds, forcing them to liquidate their personal assets, luxury vehicles, and private accounts. They were legally severed from the estate and permanently banished from the corporate hierarchy of the ranching empire. When they vacated the property a week later, they left with nothing but their ruined pride. Their social standing in the Texas Hill Country was annihilated. Former friends refused their calls, and business associates severed ties. They became cautionary tales. A month later, Eleanor passed away quietly in her sleep. I oversaw the transfer of power without a single disruption in the ranch's daily operations. I assumed full stewardship of the sprawling estate, reviewing the updated balance sheets with a steady hand. The accounting was finished. The liabilities had been purged. Now came the architecture of the future. I immediately established the Eleanor Heritage Trust. This was the justice of the sower. True justice isn't merely about the destructive punishment of parasitic elements. It is about what you choose to plant in the fertile soil they leave behind. Vengeance is a fire that consumes both parties, but cultivation is a legacy that outlasts them. I didn't waste my resources salting the earth of my aunt and uncle's ruin. Instead, I focused entirely on growth. The trust was designed to fund full-ride veterinary scholarships for adopted and marginalized students, giving them the debt-free independence I was denied. Furthermore, I reallocated a massive portion of the ranch's operational budget to restore and dramatically expand my biological father's rare cattle line. I ensured that the genetic legacy Silas tried to steal and erase would become the undisputed crown jewel of the Texas beef industry. I reclaimed the land, the lineage, and the narrative. My past was no longer a ledger of endless debts. It was the bedrock of a new empire. But as the dust settles on this sprawling estate, I've come to realize that stepping into your own true power requires leaving the ghosts behind. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the heavy, suffocating gravity of their dysfunction. I don't forgive them because they have earned absolution. I forgive them because I refuse to carry their bitter baggage into my bright future. To anyone reading this, to those who always feel they stand at the edge of their own family, looking in through a window that was never meant to open for you, I see you. I know the exhausting, invisible labor of trying to earn love from people who view you only as a transaction. I know the terror of realizing that the very people supposed to protect you are the ones holding your potential hostage. But you must deeply understand this. Your inherent worth is not defined by their profound inability to value you. You are not a burden, and your existence is not a debt to be collected. You have the absolute right to audit your own life. You have the right to firmly close the accounts that drain your spirit. It takes unimaginable, terrifying courage to cut the toxic ties that bind you, to stop accepting the meager crumbs of a brutal normalization and demand the full feast of your own autonomy. But when you finally step away from that edge, when you stop looking through their locked window and start building your own house from the ground up, you will discover a resilience you never knew you possessed. You are the sole architect of your own legacy. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment below, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into justice and resilience.